10 years. Federal prison. The threat hung in the cold, sterile air of the interrogation room. It was aimed at a 17-year-old boy in a yellow hoodie. The agent leaned closer, his smirk a mask of absolute power. You tell us who you're really working for right now. Just an hour before, that same boy was the center of a different kind of show, a public spectacle, as another officer held up his first-class ticket for the whole airport to see and declared, "This is a fake." But here's the twist they never saw coming. As they laid their trap, a gleaming $75 million Gulfstream jet was descending from the clouds, its pilot under direct orders from the boy's father to land without clearance if necessary. So what happens when the small power of a uniform collides with the silent, earth-shaking power of $1 billion? Before we continue the video, take a moment. If you can already feel the injustice in the air, hit the like button to show you're watching. And subscribe, because the collision you're about to witness isn't just about power. It's about a reckoning, and you won't want to miss how it ends. The air inside Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was a thick soup of stress, stale pretzels, and a low-grade hum of anxiety. For 17-year-old Ryan Allen, it was just a stopover, a necessary inconvenience on his way to a youth tech summit in Tokyo. Dressed in a simple yellow hoodie and joggers, he stood patiently at the security checkpoint, a first-class ticket gripped in his hand. That's when it happened. An alarm, loud and jarring, blared from the scanner. But it wasn't for a weapon or a prohibited item. It was for him. A TSA officer stepped forward, his eyes sweeping over Ryan in a single, dismissive glance. The hoodie, the joggers, the dark skin, the age. The officer's gaze then landed on the first-class ticket, and his expression curdled with suspicion. To him, the picture didn't just look wrong, it looked impossible. This boy, standing alone, holding a ticket worth more than his monthly salary? The assumption was swift. The judgment was final. It had to be fake. "Sir," the officer said, the word dripping with condescension, "you don't belong here. Step aside." He didn't ask, he commanded. The line ground to a halt. Every eye in the security theater turned toward them. Phones, like tiny digital vultures, slowly began to rise from the crowd. Ryan stood frozen, the warmth of public shame prickling his skin. He wasn't just being questioned, he was being put on display. His calm confusion only seemed to feed the officer's certainty. This wasn't a random check. It felt like a targeted hunt. The officer waved a hand dismissively. "We have a situation here. Operational necessity." The corporate, sterile words were a thin veil for the raw prejudice underneath. The officer saw a threat where there was only a teenager, a crime where there was only a boarding pass. The gears of a flawed system were beginning to turn, grinding down on one boy who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space they decided wasn't his. And as the officer gestured for another agent to join him, Ryan felt the invisible walls of the world closing in. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an accusation. Surrounded by the silent judgment of the crowd and the hostile energy of the two officers, Ryan took a slow breath. He'd been taught his whole life that composure was a shield, especially in moments like these. "Sir, there's a mistake," he said, his voice steady. "This ticket is real. My father bought it for me." The lead officer let out a short, ugly chuckle. It was a sound of pure disbelief, meant to mock and belittle. He leaned in, his name tag just inches from Ryan's face, a glint of cruel amusement in his eyes. "Oh, really? And what's Daddy's name, son?" The question was a trap, designed to make any answer sound like a lie. "Marcus Allen," Ryan replied, holding the officer's gaze. For a moment, the name just hung in the air. It was a name that opened boardroom doors and commanded billion-dollar deals. But here, in the sterile chaos of airport security, it meant nothing. Worse, it provoked a sneer. The officer clearly thought he was being played. Instead of checking a database or making a call, he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we need backup at Checkpoint Charlie. Got a possible situation here that requires further verification." The call wasn't for help. It was for show. It was an escalation, turning a simple question into a federal incident. As another agent arrived, the circle around Ryan tightened. The camera of public shame widened. Phones were now held high, their red recording lights like a dozen unblinking eyes. Every whisper from the crowd, every click of a phone camera was another layer of humiliation. Ryan wasn't a person anymore. He was a spectacle. He watched the officers exchange a look, a silent, smug agreement. And in that moment, he understood. They weren't looking for the truth. They were building a cage. The lead officer nodded curtly to his team. "Take him to screening room B," he commanded, his voice cold and final. The walk down the sterile, white corridor was a walk of shame. With an officer on each side, Ryan was marched away from the prying eyes and recording phones of the terminal, leaving the public spectacle behind for a private, more sinister stage. The heavy metal door of screening room B clicked shut behind them, and the muffled chaos of the airport was replaced by a suffocating silence, broken only by the low, electric hum of a fluorescent light overhead. The room was a sterile box. No windows, just gray walls, a scuffed metal table, and 3 chairs. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear. It was a place designed to make you feel small, a place where the truth came to die. "Backpack on the table. Empty your pockets." "ID," the lead officer grunted, the words clipped and devoid of any respect. It wasn't a request. Ryan complied, his movements deliberate and calm. He placed his wallet and passport next to his bag. The officer snatched the ID, holding it up to the light as if it were a forgery. Another agent unzipped his backpack, pulling out a laptop and a thick folder of presentation notes, handling them with a casual disdain that felt like a violation. This was all for security, they claimed, a hollow justification for stripping him of his identity piece by piece. Left in that humming silence, the walls seemed to press in, but Ryan's mind didn't panic. It went quiet. He could hear his father's voice, a memory from years ago after a similar, smaller incident at a luxury store. "They will use your skin as a reason to doubt you," Marcus Allen had told him, his voice firm but not unkind. "They will see your youth and assume you are lost, or that you are a thief. Let them. Your composure is your armor. Your intellect is your sword. Never, ever let them see you break." So Ryan did what he was taught to do. He analyzed. The lead officer had a slight tremor in his hand. He was running on ego and caffeine. The younger one was hesitant, looking for a cue. This wasn't an investigation. It was a performance. Ryan wasn't just some rich kid on a joyride. He was on his way to represent his father's company and his own project at a global youth tech summit in Tokyo. The notes they were carelessly thumbing through contained the code for an encryption protocol he had designed himself. This trip was his chance to step out of a giant shadow, to prove that he was more than just Marcus Allen's son. He was an innovator in his own right. But his composure, the very discipline his father had taught him, was a shield, only fueled their suspicion. They didn't see a calm young man applying his training. They saw a cold, practiced criminal who wasn't scared enough. In their world, a black teenager in this situation was supposed to be terrified or angry. His silence was an admission of guilt. The simple yellow hoodie he'd worn for comfort on a long flight now felt like a target, a bright, unmissable uniform marking him as a threat. One of the officers sat down at a dusty computer terminal in the corner, cracking his knuckles with a loud pop. He glanced at Ryan, then back at his partner, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "All right," he said. "Let's see who this kid really is." The performance began. The officer at the terminal started typing, but it was all for show. Each keystroke was slow and deliberate, a loud, hollow click-clack that echoed in the silent room. He wasn't searching for information. He was creating the illusion of it. The other agent stood over Ryan, arms crossed, a human wall of intimidation. They started whispering, making sure the words were just loud enough for Ryan to hear. "QR code looks off. Signature doesn't match the internal scan." Then, a more pointed lie. "This name is flagged for suspected identity fraud." They were building a crime, brick by brick, out of thin air. The standing agent picked up Ryan's passport, flipping it open with a snap. He read the name aloud, slowly, as if it were the top line on a charge sheet. "Ryan Allen." He drew out the syllables, tasting the name, turning his identity into an accusation. The goal wasn't to confirm who he was, but to tell him who they had decided he was a criminal. Ryan's mind was clear. This was a game, and he refused to be a passive player. "I'd like to speak to a lawyer," he stated, his voice even. The officers exchanged a look, and the one standing let out a low chuckle. He smirked. "You're not under arrest yet." The final word hung in the air, a naked threat. With that single phrase, they trapped him in a legal nightmare. Not yet a suspect with rights, but no longer just a passenger with a ticket. He was completely at their mercy. The agent at the computer suddenly stopped typing. The silence in the room was deafening. He swiveled his chair around to face Ryan, a manila folder in his hand which he slapped down hard on the metal table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "The good news is, we know who you are," the officer said, his voice now stripped of all pretense, cold and sharp as a razor's edge. "The bad news for you is, we also know whose corporate card you stole to buy that ticket." Ryan stared, his mind struggling to catch up with the sheer audacity of the lie. A stolen corporate card. The accusation was so specific, so detailed, that it felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The officer, seeing the shock on Ryan's face, pressed his advantage. He leaned forward, tapping the manila folder with a single, authoritative finger, as if it contained a holy scripture of guilt. "Car belongs to a senior VP at Omnicorp Financial," he said, inventing a name from thin air, his voice a low, confident hum. "Reported stolen at 0800 this morning. At 0812, a single charge was made. Transaction ID 74B-9 for one first-class ticket to Tokyo. You are in a world of trouble, son." It was a masterclass in deception, a perfectly constructed lie presented as undeniable fact. The details were the bars of the cage they were locking him in, and each new one made the space feel smaller. For the first time, a hot wave of panic threatened to break through Ryan's armor of composure. This was spiraling out of his control. His father's words about intellect being a sword felt hollow when his opponent refused to even acknowledge the truth. "That's impossible," he pleaded, his voice tight with disbelief, hearing the desperation in his own ears. "Just call my father, please. His name is Marcus Allen. He paid for the ticket with his own corporate card, the Stratos Technologies card. He can verify everything in 2 seconds." The mention of the name again sent the officers into a fresh wave of derision. The lead agent threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound in the small, sterile room. "Marcus Allen? The billionaire from Stratos Technologies? Kid, you've got a great imagination. I'll give you that." He turned to his partner with a theatrical sigh. "We got a name dropper. Thinks throwing around a big name is his get-out-of-jail-free card. It's actually pathetic." The injustice was no longer a misunderstanding. It was intentional. It was entertainment. The officer's smirk wasn't about procedure or security anymore. It was about the thrill of absolute power. He wasn't investigating a crime. He was enjoying the feeling of breaking someone he had already judged to be guilty. The air in the room thickened, heavy with the weight of a truth that no one would believe. As his options vanished one by one, Ryan's eyes darted for a split second to his phone, sitting on the table next to his confiscated passport. It was his only proof: photos with his father, contact numbers, emails, digital boarding passes. It was his last lifeline. The lead officer, missing nothing, saw the flicker of hope in Ryan's eyes and followed his gaze. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face. He didn't snatch the phone. Instead, he placed his hand flat on the table and slowly, deliberately, slid the cool glass and metal across the scuffed surface toward himself, his eyes locked on Ryan's. The scraping sound was the only thing in the room. "If what you're saying is true," the officer purred, his voice a venomous whisper, "then you won't mind if we take a look. We have to be thorough." He wrapped his hand around the phone, his knuckles turning white. "After all," he added, his smile widening, "interfering with the collection of digital evidence is a federal crime all on its own." "You can't do that," Ryan said, his voice rising with a controlled urgency. "You don't have a warrant." It was his last line of defense, a plea to the rule of law in a room that had become lawless. The officer holding the phone simply smiled, a cold, empty gesture. "Son, this is an active federal investigation," he said, the words dripping with condescending authority. "We don't need a warrant to secure evidence that's in plain sight." He held the phone up. "And right now, this is evidence." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Are you interfering with an investigation? Because that's a whole new world of trouble." Ryan fell silent, the threat choking off any further protest. He was trapped. With a flick of his thumb, the officer began scrolling through Ryan's life, his partner leaning over his shoulder to watch the show. A picture of Ryan and his father standing by their gleaming Gulfstream jet appeared on the screen. "Wow, look at this," the first officer chuckled. "Kid's got good Photoshop skills." They kept scrolling. A photo of Ryan in a state-of-the-art tech lab at Stratos headquarters. "He's even got a fake lab set up," the other one sneered. "This kid's a professional." They scrolled past messages from his friends, pictures of his family, every digital piece of his identity. And with every swipe, they painted it all as a lie. The irony was a physical weight in the room, suffocating and absolute. The truth was right there in their hands, displayed in high-definition color, and their prejudice was so powerful it rendered it invisible. They saw a fantasy because the reality of a young, brilliant, and wealthy black man was something their worldview simply could not compute. Ryan watched them, his face impassive. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, hollow clarity. They didn't want facts. They wanted a confession. They wanted submission. He sat motionless, a prisoner in a box of their making. Just as they started laughing at a photo of his home, the handle on the metal door turned with a sharp metallic click. The door swung inward without a sound. Standing in the doorway was an older man in a perfectly pressed supervisor's uniform, his face a mask of polished authority. His cold eyes swept past his two officers as if they were furniture and locked directly onto Ryan. The room fell silent. When the supervisor finally spoke, his voice was dangerously calm. "Son," he said, his gaze unwavering, "you seem to be causing my men a problem." A flicker of genuine hope ignited in Ryan's chest, the first he'd felt since this nightmare began. A supervisor. He was older, his silver hair neatly combed, his uniform immaculate. He radiated a calm, professional authority that seemed to instantly suck the toxic energy out of the room. The two officers immediately straightened up, their arrogant smirks vanishing, replaced by a look of disciplined deference. This, Ryan thought, was his chance. This man would be rational. He would listen. The lead agent launched into his well-rehearsed, completely fabricated story. "Sir, we flagged the subject for a fraudulent ticket, confirmed via internal alert that it was purchased with a stolen corporate card," he reported, the lie sounding smoother and more official each time he told it. "Subject has been uncooperative, inventing elaborate stories about a billionaire father to obstruct the investigation." The supervisor listened without a flicker of expression, his face an unreadable mask of institutional calm. He walked slowly around the small table, his polished shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. His eyes methodically scanned Ryan from head to toe. The yellow hoodie, the joggers, the exhausted but defiant look in his eyes. He picked up Ryan's passport from the table, glancing at the photo and then back at Ryan's face before placing it down with a soft click. He didn't ask Ryan for his side of the story. He didn't even acknowledge him as a person. Instead, he turned to his officers with a small, knowing smirk that sent a spear of ice through Ryan's hope. "Looks like we've got a smart one here," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. The hope Ryan had felt just moments before died a quick, brutal death under the cold fluorescent lights. This man wasn't a savior. He was the final seal on his fate, the voice of the system itself. The supervisor then addressed Ryan directly, his tone dripping with a poisonous, patronizing calm. "Son, let me explain something about experience. My men have it. They see hundreds of people like you a day. So when they exercise their professional discretion, I trust it. This is simply a standard fraud check, an operational necessity." The corporate, sterile words were more chilling than any shouted threat. They were the language of a machine that had already decided his guilt, a machine that couldn't be reasoned with. The power dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer two bullies cornering a teenager. It was the full, crushing weight of a federal institution endorsing their every action, with this man as its face. The supervisor gave Ryan one last, dismissive glance before turning his back on him to face his officers. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was stripped of all pretense, hard and cold as the metal table. Procedure is over. He's not responding to discretion. He then turned his head slightly, his icy gaze finding Ryan's once more. So now we move on to consequences. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the lead officer. Explain to him what a federal wire fraud charge looks like. Make sure he understands the 10-year minimum. I want him to feel the weight of the next decade before he tells another lie. The moment the door clicked shut, the atmosphere in the room changed. The thin veneer of procedure evaporated, leaving behind something raw and predatory. The two officers moved, their movements slow and deliberate, flanking Ryan at the table. They were closer now, invading his personal space, their presence a physical weight meant to crush his spirit. "Let's talk about your future, son," the lead officer began, his voice deceptively calm. "Or what's left of it. A federal wire fraud charge carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison. 10 years. He let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow. His partner leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And that's before we get to the Interpol red notice," he added casually. "Once your name is on that list for international fraud, you'll never step on a plane again. Not for vacation, not for work, not for anything." They were painting a picture of a life in a cage, a future erased before it had even begun. Ryan felt the cold grip of fear tighten around his heart, but his father's words echoed in his mind. "Your composure is your armor." He had one truth left they hadn't fully processed. He looked the lead officer dead in the eye. "My father owns Stratos Technologies." He said it with a finality he didn't feel, a last-ditch effort to make them see reason. The officers stared at him for a silent second, and then they exploded. It wasn't a chuckle or a smirk this time. It was a full-throated, gut-busting laugh of pure, unrestrained mockery. The lead officer wiped a tear from his eye. "Stratos Technologies?" he howled. "Sure he does, kid. And I'm Barack Obama." The room filled with the ugly sound of their amusement. The interrogation had officially become theater. When the laughter finally died, the lead officer's face hardened. He leaned forward, his hands planted on the table, his face inches from Ryan's. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "We're done playing games. You either tell us the truth right now, who you're working for, who gave you the card, or I will personally make sure this charge ruins the rest of your life." Ryan met his gaze. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something new had crystallized. It was defiance. His silence was no longer about control. It was a choice. It was a weapon. He had one more thing to say. One final detail of the truth they thought was so funny. He took a slow, steadying breath, preparing to unleash the one fact that would either save him or destroy him completely. Ryan looked from one smug face to the other. They had backed him into a corner and left him with nothing but a truth so unbelievable it sounded like a lie. He took a slow breath, the air tasting stale and metallic. He let it out to steady his voice, which came out quieter than he intended, yet with a strange, defiant clarity that cut through the hostile room. "My father is Marcus Allen," he began again, letting each word stand on its own. "He's the CEO of Stratos Technologies." He paused, forcing them to absorb it before he delivered the final, crucial detail. "It's the company, the one that designed and maintains every single security camera, every baggage scanner, and all the threat detection software in this entire airport." For a single, solitary second, the room went dead silent. A universe of possibility opened and closed in that one heartbeat. The lead officer's smirk flickered, his eyes darting for a fraction of a second toward the dark dome of the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. It was a moment of pure, uncut cognitive dissonance, where the impossible truth had a chance to land. And then the moment shattered. A low chuckle started in the second officer's throat, bubbling up until it exploded into a full-bellied, wheezing laugh. The lead officer joined in, slapping the table with his open palm, the sound cracking off the concrete walls. It was the loudest, cruelest, and most confident their laughter had been all day. "Oh, that is priceless," the lead officer gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You get points for creativity, kid, I'll give you that. Maybe you should write movies." His partner nodded, still chuckling. "So, if Daddy owns the cameras, can you ask him to delete the footage of you committing a federal crime?" They saw it as the peak of his delusion, the desperate fantasy of a cornered liar. The dramatic irony was a chasm in the room. The audience, the viewers watching this story, knew that every word Ryan spoke was the absolute truth. But in that little gray box, the officers were so blissfully cocooned in the story they had created, the story of a young, black fraudster in a hoodie, that they were completely blind to the reality sitting 3 feet in front of them. The laughter finally died down, replaced by a cold, hard finality. The show was over. The lead officer reached to his duty belt and pulled out a pair of plastic zip-tie cuffs. The sharp zip sound, as he tightened one into a loop, was the only noise. "All right, Mr. Stratos," he said, his voice flat and bored. "Hands behind your back." He took a step forward, the cuffs held ready, a symbol of their ultimate victory. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that at that exact same second, 70 miles away in the pristine headquarters of Stratos Technologies, the eyes of Marcus Allen were narrowing on a small monitor. A single green dot, the one labeled Ryan, had now been stationary for over 90 minutes. His son's flight was gone, but the dot remained a silent, glaring anomaly. The quiet unease Marcus had been feeling all afternoon finally tightened into something cold and sharp. The time for passive observation was over. 70 miles away from the cold, gray interrogation room, the world was made of glass and quiet, controlled power. At the top of the Stratos Technologies tower, Marcus Allen sat at a desk that was less a piece of furniture and more a command center for a global empire. On a small, secondary monitor, a map displayed the real-time locations of his family, a security measure as natural to him as breathing. His eyes, however, were now fixed on a single, stationary green dot hovering over a blueprint of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. It hadn't moved in over 90 minutes. His son's flight to Tokyo should have been wheels up an hour ago. The knot of unease had tightened in Marcus's gut. He pressed a button on his console. "Elena," he said, his voice calm, "give me the head of operations at Atlanta Airport Security." A moment later, a voice crackled on the line, bored and bureaucratic. Marcus was polite but firm. "This is Marcus Allen. My son, Ryan Allen, was scheduled to depart on Flight 22 to Tokyo. His tracker shows him stationary at your location. I need confirmation that he is safe." The response was a verbal brick wall. "Sir, I can't release any information regarding individuals in the screening area. It's a matter of federal policy." Marcus's calm began to fray. "This isn't about policy. This is about a missing child." "I'm sure your son is fine, sir," the voice said dismissively. "It's the busiest airport in the world. Delays happen." The line went dead. At that exact moment, Elena appeared at his side, her face pale. "Mr. Allen," she said quietly, "I've just confirmed with the airline. Ryan never boarded the plane." As if her words were a voice command, the monitor in front of Marcus flashed from green to a pulsing, critical red. A new line of text appeared under Ryan's icon, stark and final. "Communication link severed." That was it. The knot of unease in Marcus's chest flash froze into a diamond of cold, hard fury. The time for politeness was over. He swiveled his chair to a different console, one reserved for the highest-level security protocols. He placed his thumb on a scanner. The screen lit up. "Activate Sentinel Protocol," he commanded, his voice low and lethal. "Full asset deployment. My son is a missing person at Hartsfield-Jackson. I want eyes inside that airport in 10 minutes. I want him found." Across the globe, the elite members of his internal security division, ex-FBI, former intelligence officers, the best private operators in the world, received the alert. The clock wasn't just ticking anymore, it was screaming. As his team mobilized, Elena held up a tablet, her hand trembling slightly. "Sir, you need to see this." It started to go viral. On the screen was a grainy, shaky video. A boy in a familiar yellow hoodie, standing alone as a TSA officer berated him. The title read, "TSA Harris's Black Teen at ATL Airport." Marcus watched the public humiliation of his son, his face carved from stone. He saw the crowd, the phones, the sneer on the officer's face. He now understood. This wasn't a delay. This was an attack. He looked away from the tablet, his eyes burning with an intensity that could melt steel. "Elena," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Cancel the call to the airport director. Give me FAA Director Evans. Use his secure home line. Now." Thousands of miles away, a secure line, one reserved for national emergencies, buzzed on the nightstand of FAA Director Evans. He answered groggily, confused, and then his blood ran cold. The voice on the other end was perfectly calm, which made it all the more terrifying. It was Marcus Allen. There were no pleasantries. "Director Evans, my son, Ryan Allen, is being illegally detained by TSA agents in a screening room at Hartsfield-Jackson. You have his exact location. He will walk out of that room, unharmed, in the next 10 minutes. Marcus paused, letting the silence stretch. "If he does not, then on Monday morning, I will be leveraging my entire net worth to fund a full-scale, independent congressional review into your department's screening protocols, operational security, and history of racial bias complaints. Am I understood?" The director was wide awake now, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He didn't ask questions. He didn't argue. He knew that Marcus Allen was one of the few men on Earth who could make good on that threat without breaking a sweat. The moment the call ended, a shock wave of pure panic cascaded down the chain of command. The FAA director didn't call the airport. He called the national head of the TSA in Washington, D.C., waking him from a dead sleep. The head of the TSA didn't bother with details. He called the Southeastern Regional Director, his voice a furious bark. "You have a code red situation at Atlanta involving Marcus Allen's son. Fix it. Fix it right now, or you'll be unemployed by sunrise." But back in the small, windowless interrogation room, the agents were blissfully unaware of the institutional terror storm raging just beyond the door. They were gods in their little kingdom of concrete and fluorescent lights. The supervisor had returned, leaning against the wall with a smug satisfaction as his officers continued to mock Ryan's delusional stories about his father's company. They were in complete control, and they were enjoying it. A sharp burst of static crackled from the supervisor's radio on his belt. A frantic voice from the airport's central dispatch cut through the air. "Sir, we have a Priority 1 directive for National Command regarding the minor in your custody. You are ordered to." The supervisor sighed with theatrical annoyance, utterly inconvenienced by the interruption. He pressed the transmit button on his radio, cutting the dispatcher off mid-sentence. "We are in the middle of a sensitive debriefing with a hostile subject," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "We will handle it with all due discretion." He clicked the radio off, silencing the frantic voice from the outside world. That simple act of hubris, that decision to believe his authority in the room was more important than an order from National Command, sealed his fate. He turned back to Ryan with a smirk. "Now, where were we?" At that exact moment, a deep, powerful roar began to vibrate through the building's foundation. The sound of massive jet engines, impossibly close. The officers glanced at each other, confused. At the same time, the security monitor in the corner of the room, which had been displaying a static camera feed of the hallway, suddenly flashed bright red. On the screen, a single, terrifying alert blinked in bold, block letters. "Unauthorized aircraft on tarmac, Sector 4. The supervisor stared at the blinking red alert on the monitor, his mind refusing to process the words. Unauthorized aircraft on tarmac. The building was vibrating now. The low roar of the jet engines, a physical presence that rattled the very walls of their tiny, windowless room. The other two agents looked around, their smug confidence instantly replaced by confusion. "What the hell is that?" The supervisor barked into his radio, his voice tight with sudden alarm. "Identify that aircraft now." But the voice that came back was choked with a panic that felt contagious. "Sir, it's a Gulfstream G700. It didn't request clearance, it just landed. And there's a convoy of black SUVs rolling toward the terminal. They're not ours." Outside on the tarmac, controlled chaos had erupted. Ground crews scattered as the gleaming private jet taxied with an unnerving confidence, its powerful engines washing over everything in a deafening roar. Its tail number, N700ST, flashed across every security screen in the airport. In the central command hub, an operator's eyes went wide as the registration check came back in a fraction of a second. Owner, Stratos Technologies. A jolt of pure, undiluted terror shot through him. Everyone who worked at the airport knew that name. It wasn't just a company. It was the invisible god that ran their entire world. At that same moment, the convoy of SUVs, sleek and menacing, bypassed a security gate, waved through by a terrified Port Authority officer who had just received a one-line order from the FAA itself. You let them through. You don't ask questions. Back in the interrogation room, the supervisor's face had gone pale. Stratos Technologies. It's a coincidence, his mind screamed. It has to be. He was still trying to connect the dots, trying to build a wall of denial against the impossible truth when a young, terrified TSA agent burst through the door. Protocol be damned. "Sir," the agent gasped, his tie askew, his chest heaving as he pointed a trembling finger at Ryan. "The jet. The convoy. They just confirmed the manifest. It's all for him. It's for the boy." And just like that, the supervisor's entire world shattered. The smugness, the confidence, the casual cruelty, it all evaporated in a single, horrifying moment, replaced by the ghastly, blood-drained look of a man who had just walked off a cliff. The sound in the room seemed to fade, replaced by the roar of blood in his own ears. He stared at Ryan, but he wasn't seeing a teenage fraudster in a hoodie anymore. He was seeing the calm, quiet architect of his own ruin. Before anyone could speak, the doorway was filled with new figures. Men in dark, impeccably tailored suits that seemed to absorb the light in the room. Their faces were grim, their movements precise, and the badges clipped to their belts didn't say TSA. They moved with the silent, efficient deadliness of predators. One of them, clearly in charge, stepped forward, his eyes cold and assessing. "This is now a federal inquiry under the authority of the FAA," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "TSA will stand down. Now," he gestured to his men, "secure the agents. Separate them from the minor." The script had been flipped with a brutal, stunning efficiency. The interrogators were now the suspects. The lead TSA officer, the one who had been holding the zip ties, froze as one of the federal agents calmly plucked them from his hand and dropped them on the table. The men who had held all the power just minutes ago were now being motioned to stand against the wall, their authority stripped away in an instant. Their criminal mule, their delusional teen, was the son of the very man whose technology was at that moment recording their spectacular downfall. The lead federal agent spoke quietly into his wrist communicator. "Asset is secure." He paused, listening. Understood. Awaiting principal's arrival. From the hallway outside, a new sound emerged, cutting through the aftermath. It wasn't frantic or chaotic. It was the calm, measured rhythm of expensive leather shoes on the linoleum floor. The sound stopped all conversation. The federal agents stood a little straighter. The TSA officers seemed to shrink against the wall. Footsteps that carried an unmistakable weight of absolute, world-shaking power. They grew closer and closer, and then they stopped right outside the open door. The footsteps stopped. A figure filled the doorway, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. It was Marcus Allen. He wasn't large or physically imposing, but the sheer force of his presence was a physical entity, an aura of controlled, lethal power that sucked the air out of the room. He was dressed in a simple, dark, tailored suit that probably cost more than the supervisor's car, but it was his eyes that commanded the space. They were burning with a cold, quiet fury that was more terrifying than any rage. Just moments before, He had stepped out of his SUV into a chaotic swarm of flashing cameras and reporters, drawn by the viral videos and the impossible sight of a private jet parked on a commercial tarmac. He had moved through the terminal not like a man, but like a force of nature. Crowds parted without him saying a word. Airport officials, their faces ashen, scrambled to clear a path. His own security detail formed a silent, efficient bubble around him, but the truth was no one would have dared get in his way. He ignored every shouted question, every camera flash. His focus was singular. Primal, the lead federal agent, who had commanded the room with such authority just moments before, simply gave a respectful nod and stepped aside. Marcus entered the room, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. His eyes swept past the 3 TSA officers huddled against the wall as if they were nothing more than furniture. He ignored the federal agents. His gaze landed on one person and one person only, his son. Ryan stood tall, his chin up. He was exhausted. He was humiliated. But as he met his father's eyes, a profound, bone-deep relief washed over him. He was silent. He was unbroken. Marcus gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that said everything. "I'm here. I see you. You did well." Only after he had assured himself that his son was physically unharmed did Marcus Allen slowly turn his gaze upon the 3 men responsible. He looked at the supervisor, then the 2 officers, his eyes lingering on each of them for a full, agonizing second. He was a predator studying his prey, and they withered under the weight of his stare. The silence in the room was absolute. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't a shout. It was quiet, controlled, and carried the deadly precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Who?" he asked. "Touch my son?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any formal accusation. It wasn't about policy or procedure. It was personal. The officers flinched as if struck. Marcus didn't wait for the answer they were too terrified to give. He turned his back on them in a gesture of ultimate dismissal and looked to the lead federal agent. "I want the names, badge numbers, and complete service records for these 3 men. I want every frame of security footage from every camera in this airport from the moment my son arrived." He then pulled out his phone, his thumb already dialing. "It's me," he said into the phone, his voice a quiet command. "Activate the full legal response team. I want civil and federal complaints drafted immediately. Title the case Allen versus the Transportation Security Administration. We're going to dismantle them." Marcus Allen didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. Rage was a blunt instrument, and Marcus was a surgeon. As he ended the call with his chief counsel, a team of lawyers, sharp and silent as specters in dark suits, arrived and entered the room. They didn't come to argue. They came to document. One lawyer, a woman with eyes that missed nothing, began taking a quiet, precise statement from Ryan, her voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos of the past few hours. Another began methodically photographing the room, the officers' badges, the zip ties on the table, and the confiscated belongings. The supervisor, finally finding his voice, began to stammer. "Look, this was a standard procedure. We acted with operational discretion. You will be given an opportunity to provide your version of events in a formal deposition." The lead lawyer cut him off, her voice like ice, not even bothering to make eye contact. "Until then, I suggest you remain silent." The TSA supervisor and his agents, who had been masters of their universe just minutes ago, could only stand and watch, their faces pale with the sickening understanding that they were no longer participants in an interrogation, but exhibits in a federal lawsuit. The fallout was not slow. It was a tidal wave, moving with the terrifying speed that only immense wealth and influence can create. Within the hour, the viral videos of Ryan's initial detention, now paired with the unbelievable footage of a private G700 on the tarmac, became a #1 trending story in the world. News cheerings on every network flashed the same stunning headline. "Billionaire's son detained at ATL, racism and power abuse alleged." At TSA headquarters in Washington, D.C., phones rang with a fury that signaled a full-blown crisis, as high-level officials saw their careers flashing before their eyes. The Department of Justice, prodded by a single, quiet call from Marcus Allen's attorneys, was forced to announce it was monitoring the situation. The machine of bureaucracy, which had moved so slowly and carelessly to crush a teenager, was now moving with lightning speed to save itself. The most potent justice, however, was served right there in the airport. A grim-faced regional director, flown in on an emergency flight, met the supervisor and his two officers in a glass-walled office overlooking the main concourse. In full view of the passengers and the circling news cameras, he formally suspended them, pending a federal investigation. There was no discretion, no back room to hide in. They were stripped of their badges and escorted, heads bowed, through the very same terminal where they had paraded their power just hours before. The crowd parted, but this time it was not with fear, but with scorn. The same cell phones that had recorded Ryan's humiliation now eagerly recorded theirs, a perfect, brutal symmetry of justice. The supervisor risked a glance up and locked eyes with a woman who had watched him berate Ryan. She simply shook her head, her face a mask of profound disgust. Finally, Marcus and Ryan emerged. They were immediately swarmed by a wall of microphones and flashing cameras, a cacophony of shouted questions. "Mr. Allen, will you be suing the TSA? Ryan, was this racial profiling?" Marcus didn't try to shout over the noise. He simply stood still, his hand resting protectively on Ryan's shoulder, and waited for the chaos to subside. His silence was more commanding than any shout. When a fragile quiet finally fell, he leaned into a microphone, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the entire terminal. "Sometimes," he said, "the real security threat isn't what you screen for. It's who you choose to humiliate." The crowd of onlookers, passengers who had witnessed the whole ordeal, erupted in spontaneous, roaring applause. It was a sound of pure catharsis, a release of shared frustration for anyone who had ever felt small and powerless in the face of a uniform. As his father's security team began to clear a path, Ryan looked back one last time at the chaos, at the flashing lights and the faces in the crowd. He was no longer a suspect. He was no longer a spectacle. He was a survivor. Turning away from the terminal, he walked beside his father toward the gleaming jet waiting on the tarmac, the promise of escape. He stepped through the doors, leaving the stale, recycled air of the airport behind, and breathed in the cool, open air of the airfield, smelling the faint, clean scent of jet fuel. The G700 loomed before him, a monument of steel and power. And as he stepped out onto the open airfield, a single, quiet question echoed in his mind. Was this truly justice, or was it just a different kind of power? Ryan stepped onto the jet, and the heavy doors swung shut behind him, sealing out the noise of the airport and the chaos of the last few hours. The cabin was a world of quiet, understated luxury, a stark, stunning contrast to the cold, gray box where his life had almost been broken. He sank into a soft leather seat, the yellow hoodie now folded neatly beside him, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was simply a 17-year-old boy on a plane. The story, however, was far from over. In the days that followed, the incident at Hartsfield-Jackson became a national firestorm. The video of Ryan's public humiliation, followed by the stunning arrival of his father's jet, played on a continuous loop on every news network. The public outrage was swift and merciless. The TSA was buried under an avalanche of condemnation, forced to answer for a culture of bias that had been allowed to fester in the dark for far too long. The consequences were not just theoretical. They were swift and severe. The two junior officers were fired within 48 hours, their careers in federal law enforcement over. But for the supervisor, the calm, polished face of the system's arrogance, the reckoning was far deeper. The Department of Justice, facing an unrelenting legal assault from Marcus Allen's army of lawyers, brought federal charges against him for conspiracy to violate a minor's civil rights. The system, for once, was being forced to eat its own. In the wake of the scandal, real change began to take root. Pressured by a public that would no longer accept excuses, federal screening agencies across the country were forced to enact sweeping new anti-bias and de-escalation reforms, with Stratos Technologies providing the technology for new oversight, free of charge. But on the flight to Tokyo, Ryan wasn't watching the news. He wasn't tracking the fallout. He just sat by the window, watching the city of Atlanta shrink to a grid of glittering lights below. He hadn't asked for this fight. He didn't celebrate the victory. He had simply endured. He had survived because of a truth they refused to believe and a power they couldn't comprehend. His father had shown them what real power looked like, and it wasn't a badge and a uniform. They built a cage for him out of their own prejudice, so small and cramped they couldn't imagine a world outside of it. They thought he was flying too high for his color. They never knew how high he could truly go. But it leaves us with one final, haunting question. If that $75 million jet had never landed, would anyone, anywhere have ever believed him? These stories are happening every day in places where there are no private jets coming to the rescue. Make sure these voices are finally heard. Share this story so that no one can ignore it. Like this video and subscribe to become part of a community that refuses to stay silent. Because injustice thrives in the dark, and you'll want to see what's coming next.